coordinator, tour disc programs.
Fantastic. All right. Welcome, everyone. It's such an amazing roster of everybody who's here today. And so we can just dive in. This is going to be a very hands-on, interactive discussion that I will not be leading. So I'll be handing things over to Maddie and also to Laura for most of this presentation, but I have one slide that I wanted to share with you to get things started. Actually, two slides. So in our plan for today, we'll be spending about an hour going through what we know, what we want to share with you about how to do survey fielding in the museum, how to talk to people so that you can get people who say, yes, I'd love to help your museum out and answer a short little survey. And just different principles to both strategize and think about where to go in the museum to approach people, how to do that approach, what to do depending on people's responses. There's a lot of tips and tricks that we can share with you today. And we want to empower you to not just go out and follow our instructions, but to think the way that we think as researchers, so that, you know, if you're having trouble talking to people in one part of the museum, you can understand why that's happening and maybe switch your locations or switch your strategies. So that's what we're going to be doing in this first hour together. We'll be doing a few exercises around troubleshooting, practicing the ask, and then going out in teams into the museum to do some actual practice with visitors today. That will last about 30 to 45 minutes. And then after that practice, everybody will be coming back to this room for a debrief to think about what you've learned in different places in the museum and want to share with each other as this process begins. So before we get into the nitty-gritty details, I just want to talk about for a few minutes the larger goals of this research project. And Anne really did a great job talking about what this larger research process is meant to do for the museum and really bringing that momentum of evaluation to your future decisions. And I want to talk about the specific phase, this survey that we together as a group will be doing, talking to museum visitors and others in the community. And what it's designed to do is provide a profile of current and potential Nelson Atkins Museum of Art visitors and potential audience members. And so that word profile is a really interesting thing. Once we're done with this survey process, what you'll have from us is a report. There will be charts and graphs. It will be a profile of different characteristics of your audience. We will also be thinking about opportunities when we see differences, different desires that people have, different behaviors. That profile lets us look at where we see differences, and it's a tool that you can use to then say, well, what's going to be the next steps here? How can we think about better approaching certain parts of our audience versus others? But the key thing is that it's a tool. We're not going to be coming back out of the survey and saying, we think you should do this. This survey is more of a landscape where you can see where opportunities lie in that landscape, but they do require additional exploration. So there'll be the different strategies after this profile comes into your hands that you'll have more meetings about. So this is just an ongoing process, is what I want to say, of which this is a very important step, but this is not an end step. This is just part of the iteration. And some of the things that we're hoping that this process can help with are core priorities of the museum. And we have 4 that are outlined here that we've really closely articulated and debated and discussed with the Nelson Atkins team to think about what we can come out of this survey with. For one, we want to understand the broader population, both current visitors and non-visitors to the museum, so we can understand what might bring more people in. And so that means that this in-museum survey fielding that you'll be doing is just a part of our survey process. More to come on that. And then we also want to understand how people connect with culture and art. And that could be in the museum, it could be in other ways, beyond what a museum does, beyond what you do currently, or perhaps in some of your programs you do. But there's just so many ways that we in our research see people engaging with art and culture. And so this survey, as you look through the questions, you'll see that not all of them apply to what people do in museums. It's a way to look at opportunities out there to bring things into the museum in the future, or for you to get out of the museum and reach people in other ways. Also, we are hoping to understand barriers for engaging with art, specifically in art museum settings. we want to know, for those who aren't coming yet, what is the hurdle that they feel they need to, is keeping them from enjoying the experience here. And once we can understand that, then that will spur future conversations about what you might want to do to better engage those folks. And that's that last point, thinking about potential avenues for changes to the experience of the museum, to how the museum communicates with different people and communities in Kansas City. So that's really the end goal of all of this research. So you will have a chance to both give people the survey, but we hope you'll also have a chance to look through the survey yourself and see what we're asking visitors and potential visitors to share, so that once you see these results, you'll have a really good idea of where they come from and exactly how much you can trust them. We hope you'll be able to trust them pretty extensively because you're part of this process from the beginning. So I'm going to hand things over to Maddie, or actually to Laura first, just to talk about how this research process is in some ways different from what you're already doing at the museum, and then in other ways is really just continuing that iterative process of evaluation.
So yeah, just real quickly, just sort of what they touched on, that the goals of this research project is a lot different than what we've done previously, because it builds specifically on like sort of what we already know, but this research will have us understand these potential and visiting audiences on a larger scale, in a different, like how they interact, or how people interact with art and culture more broadly. And just as a little side note too, like when we kind of look over the research plan, like our gut reaction might be like, oh, this seems like a lot of work and a lot of steps. And I just wanted to share a little quote that helps to kind of like summarize that. It's it seems like a lot of work, but survey research in design is sort of the ultimate shortcut to these really ambitious questions we have. And so it's, to speak to every visitor would be impossible. Therefore, sampling methods are used in survey research to allow us to select a random group to represent the entire population. So just keeping in mind that this is, we have a lot of really ambitious questions with this project, but this phase especially, allows us to get to those questions in a way that's feasible. And I think that's all I have for this section. So, all right.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. As Tanya started to introduce, there are a couple of different audiences or groups that we are planned to hear from during this quantitative survey. What we're here to talk about today will be the in-museum intercept survey that we're doing. So you'll see up top, the primary audience we'll be speaking to as a part of this training will be general visitors to the museum, with the goal of getting to hear from any general visitor who may come throughout the year. We'll be fielding this survey across 3 different seasons in order to achieve that goal. But outside of hearing from the voices and opinions of people who are already coming to and engaged with your institution, we're also going to be fielding a community survey. So we'll be doing a separate online survey where we hear from non-visitors to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, people who haven't visited in some time, as well as some visitors, to hear how their opinions, needs, and preferences differ from the people that you're already connecting with. That online survey will be conducted through a third-party consumer panel, and something that we at Slover Lynette will be managing. But another part that we're going to be working with you, the Nelson Atkins team, on is a third component, doing a local intercept survey of community members, which will supplement that online survey we'll be conducting as well. We know that these panel providers that we work with only reach a certain portion of the audience through online surveys. We're only reaching people who tend to take online surveys. We're only reaching people who have access to a computer. We're only reaching people who may happen to be on this particular list. And while we'll send out this online survey to reach a representative sample of the community, we know that there may be voices that we could be missing or diminishing. So we're going to work with you to go out into the community to make sure that we hear these voices. So at the end of the day, as Tanya said, when we have this report that we give to you, we know that we've heard from hopefully everybody or as many different people that we could have heard from during this process. To get down to a little bit more of the logistics and numbers of how we'll be doing these 3 different pieces. For the in-museum intercept survey, as I mentioned, we'll be conducting that across 3 different seasons throughout the year so that we hope to reach the full picture of your audience. We'll be starting the winter fielding relatively soon. Laura's working on finalizing that calendar right now to start in late January and early February. We'll be doing an additional round of in-museum intercepts in the spring and in the summer. Dates for that are a little bit to be determined, but we would like to get about 150 surveys total per each round of fielding that we do. That'll give us a really nice sample size to work with of a total of 450 to potentially even more, perhaps 600 respondents that we've heard from in the museum, so we can compare different types of visitors. Not only seeing how visitors in the summer look different to visitors in the spring in terms of why they came to visit, what they might have wanted out of their experience, what kind of programming they're looking for, but also to break it down into different types of people as well. People that are visiting with young children versus people who aren't visiting with young children, people who are from the general local area, from the broader surrounding suburbs, and from further out. Having a nice, robust sample size will allow us to do that. In addition, we'll be doing the online survey that I mentioned. That'll be something that Slover Lynette will manage, but it'll happen sometime in spring of 2019. And then the in-community survey will be conducted across 2 rounds of fielding. Those will be in the spring and summer, where we've been working with the research and evaluation and broader team to identify locations with people whom we might want to speak to, and working on cultivating different relationships through great community connections we have in order to be able to field on those grounds. Determining who those additional people are and what they may look like is something that we're still in communication about. And once we do the online panel in spring, we'll also be able to see who we want to hear from more that we weren't able to reach through that avenue, and increase our sample through the in-community work in that way at that time. So now getting a little bit more into the how will we collect our data component of the training today. The first point we'd like to talk about is the location for doing these in-museum intercept surveys. One thing that I don't think I touched on the last slide, we think that each of these fieldings will last about 2 weeks, and there'll be a mix of staff and volunteers going out into the galleries at scheduled times to try to intercept people to ask for their opinion and participation in our survey. One of the key things that we always consider to lead to great success and more yeses than nos is the location that we select for conducting these fieldings. And there's a couple of key things that I think are really helpful to think about when you're trying to figure out where would be a great place to intercept somebody, to not interrupt their experience and make it as easy of an experience for them to participate in our survey as possible. Number 1 for me is there seating available. There's ever a bench that you can usher somebody to after intercepting them. That makes it a lot easier for them to say yes, gives them somewhere to stop and pause, and we all know how important benches can be in a museum experience for some people. We do recommend looking for locations that don't disrupt other visitors' experiences. We may not want to stop somebody when they are looking at a piece of artwork or when they are in deep reflection in a gallery, but perhaps if they're crossing from one gallery to another and there's a bench nearby, that would be a really great part when they're at a pause in their experience to intercept them and see if they'd be available. We'd like to notice what the traffic pattern is like in that location. If it's going to be a really congested area, that might not be the best spot to do it. And you'll notice in the next slide, we'll be doing, as we've said a few times now, a random intercept method of approaching people to take the survey. Meaning we won't be asking every single person, but every 3rd person or every 4th person in some random manner. And so you will want to pick a place where there is some sort of invisible line, like a threshold from a gallery to the next, where you can count people as they're coming in to keep an accurate count to know that you're randomly selecting people. So keeping a couple of those components in mind, comfort, bench, perhaps an area where it's going to be easier intuitively to intercept people and ask them to take a pause from their experience for a 10-minute survey. We are hoping to use you guys as a resource to brainstorm a couple of locations in the Block building and in the Nelson Atkins building where you think it might be a friendly place for people to stop and participate. Please.
Does your survey tool require internet access?
Oh, that's a great question and something that we are excited to share. It does not require internet access. So we can do this anywhere in the institution. It is an offline survey app that we'll be showing you how to use later on. I believe Laura or Alyssa will be in charge of uploading all of those surveys, and that's the only time that you need internet connection. So we can go anywhere this time.
So this is our first interactive moment with everybody. And anybody who has spent time in the galleries can throw out a few suggestions here. We're going to need at least 8 locations to send groups to today. So the more the better. I'll just write a few things down.
And as Tanya mentioned, at the end of this, we're going to send everybody out into the galleries, and we'll select a couple of these locations to test out and see how they work and find out. I know today's going to be probably a relatively quiet day in the museum, but seeing which locations seem to be pretty successful, where you found a bench, where it didn't work that well today, things like that.
Gucci Court.
Right. That's in the block building. Oh.
Nope.
Yeah, please.
By the museum store.
Yep. Do the museum store in the block building.
The block galleries in front of the Monet.
Great.
In block lobby, the transition between the 1933 building and the block lobby.
Yeah, that's great.
I'll put it in the middle.
Kirkwood Hall.
Mhm.
I was just to say Kirkwood Hall, just outside of Roselle.
Great.
Lynn's Floor.
What was that?
High traffic.
Where at?
Lens.
Lynn's Floor is on the way down just before you get to the Gucci Court.
Lynn's
Right,
Floor?
there's a bench.
Oh.
There's a bench, and it's out of the traffic path.
Yeah, where that additional entrance is from the from the
From
front
the
lawn.
outside?
Yeah, from the front lawn. That'll be in the the walk.
Shani's painting or like Shani's ceramic.
Yep, that's a really good suggestion. And I love that one because we're talking about a lot of areas where we know there'll be a lot of people, but we do want to make sure we get a range of locations in the museum so that we do range those people who come to the quieter galleries or seek out those quieter experiences, seek out specific galleries that may be their favorites but may not be the high traffic areas. So any other places like that would be great too.
Today, on a temporary basis, the seating that's normally in Kirkwood Hall is in Gallery P13, which is the paper rotation gallery.
Okay.
Union space.
Right? What was that? Yeah.
The Rotunda?
American Rotunda, where the Thomas Hart Bentons are. Oh, sorry, Nelson Atkins building. Maybe we. Yeah. Yeah, that one, the American Rotunda. Yep. Maybe 2 or 3 more. Like maybe we could think of. Yeah, maybe 1 more in the block building, 1 more in the Nelson Atkins.
Up near the gates of Paradise.
Oh, yeah.
I think we could have discussed this, but are we open to doing outside the sculpture park?
Yeah, I think. I don't know that we discussed it, but I think that would be great. Yeah.
I think we had a discussion these days.
Yeah.
And you think the foyer areas off of Kirkwood Hall that are at the entrances to the gallery, so there's 4 different
Yeah.
doorways there. I think there are little benches right there.
And that would be especially capturing people as on the way out, or maybe heading that way.
That's good.
That's great.
Isn't there a bench inside the photography galleries, right, as you come down the little staircase? That might be a good.
That's great.
It's in
Yeah,
block
the photography galleries and the block gallery. That'll be great. And that is sort of you're a threshold from a certain type of art experience to a different type. That would work well. Anything else or any other successful locations that, you, Laura, or volunteers have used before? Now that we can think outside of the Wi-Fi box a little bit too.
Well, the museum store exit or up near that donation box a little bit further, that usually produces most of our high volume stuff. So that's a pretty solid.
Yeah. And then I was wondering about the Quay. Would Quay Coffee be a good location, or is that?
That's near the gates.
Okay.
Near the
Oh,
gates.
great.
It is sculpture hall up there.
It is.
Oh, yeah.
Sculpture Hall?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That would be a good one.
It's
It's in the Nelson.
Yeah, it's in the Nelson. Okay.
Oh, right there, yeah.
Great.
There
Okay.
aren't any benches in the sculpture hall, that's the only thing. There's plenty. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't.
That's cool. And I think we'll have some opportunities to experiment for you today. I think when we are passing along our lessons, it's often a balance between places that are comfortable for visitors to take a survey and high traffic areas to try to get as many surveys as possible, as well as any specific areas where if you're that might be niche for somebody, but you don't want to miss those type of visitors. So we're trying to always just make sure that we're thinking of all those things, and so hopefully you can be thinking of all those things too now.
Yeah. Great. So next we'll talk a little bit more about the random intercept component. As Laura's going to build upon in a moment, we're going to be doing a random intercept method instead of a census, so we won't be talking to every single visitor. We'll be talking to, as a start, every third visitor who crosses an imaginary line. So how you do this process of a random intercept survey is you're going to want to create an imaginary line somewhere and then count the people as they enter, let's just say for this example, the gallery. You'll want to count, and then every third visitor who crosses that imaginary line, you like to approach and ask to take the survey. This is a really safe way to ensure that you are randomly intercepting visitors to the museum without potentially introducing any bias into whom you ask to participate. For me, still, it's really easy to want to go to ask those go-to people who you know will be a lot more likely to say yes. To feel a little bit more comfortable asking somebody that looks like me than asking somebody that's going to be of a different age than me. Feeling more comfortable asking somebody that's going to be by themselves rather than asking a family. But so by not paying attention to who you're asking, but by paying attention to the number, it's a lot easier to keep on this more sound method. We do recommend looking at people's feet when they're crossing the threshold at times, especially if you find yourself already feeling a little bit nervous about who you're going to intercept and ask, because that removes looking at who the person is and really only focusing on the number so that we can secure that random sense of who we're intercepting. When you do have visiting parties of more than one member, just choose one member in the group, the person closest to you, and intercept them and ask if they'd be able to take the survey. It is important that we do our best as possible to ensure that only one person takes the survey rather than having a family or a group of 2 to 3 individuals take the survey. We just kindly let them know that we are doing this survey research method called a random intercept model, which means that we can only hear from one person at a time to ensure that it's random and would prefer not to have groups take the experience. That's a really nice opportunity for you to just chat with the other people in the group. They're generally really comfortable going out on their own and exploring the gallery, and when you have just somewhere comfortable like a bench or somewhere out of the way in the hall to pull somebody else aside as they take the survey really quickly, it won't interrupt anybody else's experience. As I mentioned, to avoid bias, let the individual decide if they like to take the survey. You'll find once you get on the ground, as some of you know, that people really enjoy sharing their opinions, so you don't need to be afraid of asking. The worst you're going to hear is no. Just pay attention to the line again, count till every third visitor, and ask the next person who comes your way. Laura, I believe there are a couple of things you wanted to say about this kind of method that we're doing that's a little different.
All right, so this method overall is super similar to the method we do currently with the exit surveys, but I just thought it would be a great opportunity to kind of further explain sort of the importance of adhering to the protocol, the goal sort of being that each of us as individual data collectors will introduce lots of biases. People respond to us based on how they perceive us, whatnot. We have our own biases, subconscious, whatever, conscious. So the goal is have all the data collectors sort of act as one in terms of the consistency, but then also the importance of the visitor selection, that random selection method. One thing that, another little tidbit of from the literature that helped me really kind of grasp it is sort of that that survey researchers place complete reliance on data collectors since they are ultimately identifying the people in the sample, and that if you remember that the goal of this research is to maintain a profile of the overall population and not to describe the specific sample, that helps to, reiterate that importance of adhering to that random visitor selection method. And then also, again, with sample sizes, to just, depending on the type of research, but here, because we are interested in so many different layers of learning about these different audiences, that there needs to be as many surveys as we're trying to get. So that's all I wanted to share there.
Yeah, and she was saying it's most important that we just make sure that we aren't missing anybody, and we do our best to make sure that we invite every single type of person that's coming to the museum, and that in our community and online panel that isn't coming to the museum, to understand who they are and their relationship to art and the potential relationship they could have to the Nelson Atkins. The next most important part, the ask when you intercept somebody after they've crossed your third line. A lot of it is just going to be doing a lot of this visitor-facing work that I'm sure most of you have done at different points in your experience at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. You'll just want to approach them head on with a smile, look them in the eyes, and just mention that you're conducting a survey on the behalf of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. Emphasize that their input is important and what it may be going to, and give them an estimate of how long this may take of their time. You'll see that we've drafted a little bit of a script here that we recommend using, but we'd like you all to make it your own, and we'll give you a couple of times today to get to practice this a little bit, but keep those things in mind. Let them know that you are working for or with the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, so you'll be helping the museum. Emphasize that their input is important and that it'll be their input will help better inform what the museum does moving forward. It'll help them better understand how to better serve visitors like you, and that we are doing complementing work to understand people who aren't coming to the museum, to better understand how to serve them as well. And then make sure you mention how long it's going to take, letting them know that it is going to take about 10 minutes, but that their input is extremely valuable. As we'll continue to emphasize, be all right with refusals. You'll have people who aren't interested in taking a survey, who don't have time to take a survey, who may have been intercepted by somebody else in the museum and you're intercepting them for a second time. That's all right. That's just going to be a part of the process. You'll find that more people than not are going to be really excited to take your survey and share their opinions and have a lot to say. If people are hesitant to take the survey, feel free to positively encourage them, once again, letting them know that their input is extremely valuable and they don't need to meet any criteria to participate in this survey. This is a little bit different than some of the other surveys that you've done, where it technically isn't an exit survey. We're not asking them anything about the experience that they've had. If they're satisfied with their experience, they can take this at any time in their visit, even if they've just come to the museum. This is to better understand who they are as a person and what their preferences are when it comes to arts and culture. Maybe simple things like who they visit with or why they chose to visit that day. But all of these questions could be asked of somebody once they first walk in the door. So if people have some hesitations about things like that, you can assure them that they need no prior knowledge in order to participate. But if they're not interested, no problem. Say thank you, and then go back to your imaginary line and count till you're every third person. Before we get to getting a yes, to talk a little bit more again about the likelihood of getting a yes, we see a range of acceptance or response rates from people in these intercept surveys. It can range anywhere between 20 to 50% for intercept surveys, meaning that only half of the people that you ask may be likely to say yes. That's why we think it will take about 2 weeks to reach 150 respondents. But that's okay if there's a lot more that you can do to make yourself feel comfortable when you're out here asking people to share their time with you, and to make them feel a little bit more inclined to want to. As many of you already do, having some sort of badge or name tag identifying who you are and that you have a relationship with the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art is really helpful, because it lets them know right away that you are official and this is going towards helping the museum. And using a lot of the visitor-facing work we've already done, just approach them with a smile, ease, and confidence to make them feel comfortable at first. You don't need to ever run after people.
We've all done it, though.
We have all done it. But you'll see when we're practicing in our galleries, and as we continue to think of the threshold, I'll most likely, when I'm looking at my threshold, be facing my threshold. Somebody comes through, I approach them with a smile, ask my request if they please participate in the survey. And if they say no, I say no problem, and then move back to my old spot and wait for the next person to come. There should, we'd avoid the idea of standing next to or against our threshold, as it's not an exit survey, so we don't need to see people leaving, so that you never have to run after somebody and grab them, which will feel a little funny for me, I would think.
And that's why we think having this idea of a threshold in your mind is really helpful. If you're thinking about a certain spot that people are walking past in the room you're in, or if it could be a door, or it could just be a part of a hallway. If that threshold is there, it helps so you don't have to run over to people randomly. They're coming to you. They're coming past your spot. So it just avoids that entire situation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And no need to be pushy. It's welcome to be encouraging if people have a little bit of hesitation, but if they're not interested, that's no problem. We'll be fielding across a number of days over 3 different seasons to make sure we hear from everybody, even if we miss a couple of people who just don't have the time to participate that day. One other component that we'll get into a little bit later when we walk through the app in a couple of slides is this idea of having a partial respondent. You'll, of course, have the clear-cut cases where somebody agrees to participate in the survey. You hand them the iPad, and they participate for about 10 minutes. People who choose not to participate, which is completely fine. And then those few cases where somebody starts participating and their family member needs to go use the bathroom, or they realize that they have to be somewhere in 10 minutes to meet somebody, and they'll have to only be able to take a part of the survey. That's completely fine. We'll walk through the steps of what that actually looks like on the app. But we would like you to still save that person's response, because depending how far they've made it in the survey, we actually still may be able to use a fair amount of their data. Say they made it through 3/4 of the way through the survey and we just don't know some of their demographic information. That's still a robust amount of information for us to be able to use to get a sense of who they are. And so we'll walk through in a couple of slides what this actually looks like, where they actually hand the survey back to you. You have to do a different step than you normally would of Xing out of the survey screen, just letting us know why they said they were no longer able to take the survey, in case there's any trend that we noticed there in terms of the survey being too long. Anything that may come up that we should be paying attention to will be a little bit different of a process than the regular yes-no survey intercept scenario. Cool. Just a couple of troubleshooting a couple of things that may come up when you're doing the in-museum intercepts. Respondents often are curious about the purpose of the survey, either those who are taking it before they agree to take the survey, or some of their guests in their party who may not be participating, who generally are the ones who have the most questions since they can't take the survey at the time. And you can feel free to let them know some of what we're talking about today in more broader terms, but similar to the ask. Feel free to answer those type of questions to whatever level you feel comfortable. Letting them know that we are doing this in-museum intercept survey to better understand visitors to the museum. We'll be doing it across a couple of seasons to understand all visitors, and that'll just help inform the work that we're doing here at the museum. Respondents may also be curious about you and your role at the museum. You can feel free to share that to whatever extent that you're comfortable. But again, these are just generally friendly questions people have that shouldn't bias any of their responses. To jump to the bottom a little bit, the only part that we would caution against is be neutral yourself in terms of how you are asking them questions, or if there is any way that you feel like you could be biased in your response, do your best just to be slightly aware of that. The best example is one that we have up there of asking whether they liked or disliked something while they're still taking the survey, because we don't want to introduce any positivity bias where they feel any need to be overly positive or overly critical based on the types of questions that we ask. I'd say this is very infrequently happen, but just to warn against that. And this is, again, questions when you're talking to the person taking the survey. If they're sitting on a bench and you're having a side conversation with the 2 other people in their visiting party, you can feel free to have a little bit more of an informal conversation, but we just don't want to introduce any bias or any obligation they would feel when they meet you and all you wonderful people and wanting to say really nice, positive things or feel the need to be critical in order to be useful in the survey necessarily. One other thing that we'd warn against is if there is any instance where people ask you to help explain the question or what answer options mean, we'd use your best judgment in terms of helping them understand what the question is asking them, but not helping them interpret how they may want to respond. Again, a really good example of that would be, we have a question in the survey asking people what they hope to get out of an experience when they go out with friends and family. It's a really broad question. We give them about 12 different answer options, and one of them is to be inspired. And we know that to be inspired may be a little bit different for all people. And if somebody asks, well, what does it exactly mean to be inspired? We just like their own reflection on, of the list of things that we give them, to spend time with friends and family, to learn something, to be inspired. What does be inspired mean to you, and is that what you look for when you're going out to an experience? So if they ask you something like that, the response I gave would be a great way of answering that question. Well, whatever be inspired means to you is how I'd like you to read it, and that would be really helpful for us. And usually that's enough to help them think about the right way to answer those questions. There is another set of questions. It's going to be 3 sets of questions that we call forced choice questions that we also know are generally somewhat difficult for people to answer. Forced choice questions are a question where you pick A or B. When going out to spend time with friends and family, I prefer to get to know the people in my group better, or I prefer to meet people outside of my group. And we have 3 sets of questions like that in our survey, which admittedly are hard to answer, but they're really useful questions for us in something called a segmentation analysis that we'll be doing later on behind the scenes in this process to identify different segments or different people within your audience based on what kind of things they prefer to do. So outside of demographics, outside of where they come from, just based on how they generally prefer to experience the world. So it's really helpful and important for all people to answer these questions, and we know they're difficult. If somebody brings that up to you, that I don't know how to answer this, depending on what I'm doing, I prefer to spend time with the people I'm with, but if I'm doing something else, I prefer to meet new people. Just ask them to answer the question how they feel today, or how they feel when at their experience in the museum today, and that can be the best guidance we give them, because these questions are a really good tool for the type of analysis we'd like to do, but are inherently, naturally pretty difficult for people to answer. And you guys will have the opportunity to take the survey yourself a little bit later, so you'll see what I'm talking about. Next, we're going to do a little bit of an exercise where you guys will get to troubleshoot together. Tanya will introduce this a little bit more.
All right, so during our different activities today, we will be splitting into some groups. And there are enough people here, which is great, I think, to split into groups of 4 each. So it may be easiest for people sitting next to each other to form groups. So maybe you 4 can form a group. You 4. Here's the tiny 4 people here. Here. And you can cluster together and talking with your group. So if you can get a little bit closer to everybody to make that happen. If you're part of this group, and then so we have 3 people here. And now that you have your group, we have these different troubleshooting exercises. So for everybody on this, before you get into the groups, I just want to introduce our exercise. So for everybody on this far side of the table, I'd like you to look at 1 through 4. If you're approaching somebody and asking them to take this survey, what happens if they hesitate? What happens if they try to hand off the survey to somebody else in their group? What if they are somebody who you haven't asked, but they really want to participate? And what if they say, oh, I'm not from around here? I'd like you to, in this far side of the table, to think through those first 4 options and how you might respond to those. And then again, for this other side of the table, we'll do 5 through 8. What happens when somebody just says no? What happens when they say their kids won't sit still for a survey? What happens when they say they don't speak English well? And then what happens if they say they've only been at the museum in 10 minutes? Just talk in your group about what you would do. Afterwards, we will just have people shout out some answers and share what we would do as well for those things. So we'll give you about 5 minutes for that.
Thank you. Also, good job sussing out the phrases most of it is like intermittently I can't
Which one should we recommend?
I don't know. Why don't we? Okay, let's ask Laura.
The transition.
I would do
The transition area.
Okay. I would do the museum store and they could say they could also go to that link. The other ones to do the art gallery.
Kirkwood is downstairs.
Kirkwood and sculpture. I would be upstairs. I was going to do the American. I could go to Chinese painting and American. Those are like kind of the opposite ends. Here, my favorite.
And then I was going to say Chinese painting if you're having trouble with it.
I would having the American. American and other Chinese are on the second.
So just somebody on the second side.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I'm not like targeting you guys. I want to talk to you. I really want to talk to her.
I guess we could try the paper gallery. Those are not close enough together. Yes. Give me 1 more minute. It's probably been enough time.
I think they're mostly done. All right. It sounds like everybody's close to being done. All right. Ask everybody to direct their attention back up here. We'll get started. Hey everyone, we're going to get started down at the bottom of the table. Oh, that's good. All right. Great. How did everybody find that exercise? Was it easy? Was it challenging?
Raise some other questions.
It does raise questions. I think a lot of the survey fielding method, there's a lot of ambiguity to it. Every moment you're out there, you don't know how people are going to respond to you. So that's why we want to share some hypothetical situations, because there's no one right answer, but there are some general directions which can help you in your method. So I'm just going to go through all 8 of these and then have people shout out what you and your group talked about. So let's start with number 1. What happens if people hesitate? What might you do if somebody hesitates?
reinforce the importance of their response to learning and improvement of easy.
Yeah, and one thing that I know we haven't adequately touched on is all of their responses will remain anonymous. We won't be asking for any contact information or any identifying information from them. We just want their opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. Other groups, do you have any additional ideas for that?
Just assure them that there aren't any qualifications for it, that anybody's eligible.
Yep.
And that it really will take 10 minutes, and is that true?
Yes, it is, and we have tested it. We're going to continue to test it with you, and we'll be paying attention to the duration, and if people say that it's taking too long, so we can keep that in mind.
Yeah.
And we were wondering, 10 minutes sounds kind of long to some people, so how many questions is that? It would be easier for us to say it's only 16 questions.
It's really fun. There are a lot of really fun questions.
And it does vary a little bit, too.
It varies depending on how you answer for certain ones.
Right. Yeah.
I would say it's around 30.
It's around, yes.
Around 30 questions.
Yes. 10 minutes is good.
Some are very quick ones.
It's around 30, but one other thing that could be helpful in that same way, which we'll get into the next slide, is you could say what it's going to be about so that they can see its progression. So we want to learn about where you visit in Kansas City. We want to learn about what you look for in your free time. We want to know if you visited the Nelson before, and then we want to know a little bit about you. But if you don't want to answer those questions about you, the demographic questions, you don't have to.
And is it one of those apps that does it go by screen, and as you're saying it, it's like you're 40%, 50%?
It's not.
Yeah, we choose not to do that because we have front-loaded it. The harder questions are at the beginning. Once you get closer to the end, it's very quick to go through. But because of that, it looks like you're only 40% of the way through, but you're practically done with the hard stuff at 40%.
And one thing that we actually I don't think have discussed in depth that we could consider is we don't have what I think you're bringing up is a progress bar where it shows how you're going along, because as she mentioned, there's some challenging questions in the beginning. At the end, they go really quick. But we have in the past introduced language saying you're halfway there or you're only a quarter of the way there, so that they have that in a different way. So we can consider that and talk to the team about that a little bit more as well.
Yep. And that'll be great. Even today, is you're going out there and testing with 1 or 2 people. You can see what happens. We'll also be able to adjust along the way.
So would you say avoid answering directly the question about how many questions, because 30 might get us to know, and instead saying there are a number of different questions that touch on these topics?
If it were me, I would want to be as straightforward with the person as possible. If they ask exactly how many questions, I would say, similar to what Tanya said, it's 25 questions. It's 25 questions, but it'll go really quick. We have some more difficult questions in the beginning, and it'll go much faster at the end. If you do have to stop in the middle, that's not a problem at all, because frequently I found once you get somebody to commit, they become invested themselves, they get a quarter of the way through, and they're going to finish it because they've already gotten started. So I favor being honest to build that trust with them and through that conversation. But yeah, just letting them know to whatever degree you're comfortable about what's included is good.
Yeah. What happens if somebody tries to hand off the survey to somebody else in their group? How might you respond to that? It's a tricky one. Yeah, go for it.
Well, we stressed how important it was that we, choose them, and that we're doing the random intercept model, and so they were the kind of the lucky winner.
Yeah.
To be able to answer the question.
Yeah. That's a great phrase to use. Yeah. You're a lucky winner.
Yep.
Yeah.
That was a marketing spend.
That's great.
And that's worked for us in the past, just explaining, and kind of poking fun a little bit about across the line, well, this is our invisible line here, so, your friend was selected and you weren't, and then people chuckle at that, and then they're like, oh, okay, I get it. So,
yeah. And this making sure you have those lucky winners is really important. It's the reason we don't have to talk to every single person who comes in the doors, because we can do this random method. So putting that in a positive way to people it works really well.
When you described, if a group comes in, you're looking, if they all enter at the same time, you're choosing the person that's closest to you. But if the person that's closest to us hasn't started the survey and they don't want to, we're not supposed to go to anyone else in that group, but just count them as a whole entity going past?
I would likely count them as a whole entity going past and then move from there.
Yeah, yeah. I think it can get a little tricky when you're dealing with these larger groups. We're counting individuals, but if you're counting individuals and they're at one group, it's the third person in the group that's walking in the door. But then, just to not worry about, okay, who's next in that group, you just start from scratch. You can always start from scratch. You never worry about, I've lost my count. It's fine. If you lose your count, just start from zero. Whoever walks in next is your 0, 1, 2, 3, and then that person will be.
Do you have, I'd be a little afraid that I would just start focusing on individuals rather than groups. Do you have any sort of strategies for really thinking about the group dynamic past that individual line and thinking about the count?
Yeah. Thinking about individuals rather than groups. I think for me, looking at their feet's the best way to do it, because you're going to be, if one person in the group says no, you'll be dismissing them as a group, but think of it maybe as a visiting party then, that you're counting every third visiting party together, whether it looks like they're an individual or they're coming as a couple or they're coming as a family type thing. Because when you have that third person come through and they're in a group of 5, you won't be going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1 after that until the second person comes in. Maybe visiting party is the best way to think of it.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be precise. The key is that it just needs to be random. So as long as you're not targeting, that's why we say, it could be, if it's really slow, maybe it is every second person who comes through the door.
Yeah.
If it's really busy, maybe it's every 5 people, because you just can't you can't count them quick enough. But as long as it's random, as long as you're just trying to have some method to the madness, then it's consistent. Yeah.
Another question, do you need to wait until the person who's doing the survey has completed it to start your count again?
That is not something that we've had the opportunity to discuss with the research and evaluation team in depth yet, but in short, no. If you have more than one iPad, then we can go in that manner. I think we are still figuring out the schedule together of how many people will be scheduled at one time and where they will be in the museum, and then we can give them more than one iPad. So that's actually, you're right, a really important question. For example, when I fielded paper and pencil surveys in the past, we still did that random intercept method, but I would have 3 to 5 clipboards available and a small table so that every third person I could ask to participate in the survey, grab them a seat, and then start my count again while 2 people are still working on it. I can invite a third person so that we can keep the numbers coming in.
Yeah. So that might be a strategy here too, but yet to be determined. Yes.
Sorry, I think this is kind of returning to the same question, but I guess I still don't understand if you have 2 people crossing the line at the exact same time. You're kind of counting them as one entity, so they're both the third visitor group. And the one you talk to says, I'd rather not, and their friend is like, well, I could do it. Why can't you hand off to the other person if they're essentially both the third person?
Yeah.
One of the components that we're not trying to introduce would be, it may be a way you're describing it, where we don't want to get extroverts versus introverts to be participating in the survey. I'm also acknowledging that I'm limiting the way I think, where you could think of a couple and the couple hands it off to the other person in their partnership because that's how they do things, and maybe that person does tend to be the decision maker, and maybe it would be helpful to hear from them, but we want it, as Tanya said, to be as random as possible so we don't get the people who really want to share their opinion. It's exactly why for the panel, it's one of the reasons for the panel, the online survey, we're adding a community segment to it, so we don't just get people who take surveys, we get a little bit of everybody.
Yeah.
Don't you think that could offend people though? It's like if I come in with a woman and you want to hear her opinion but you don't want to hear my opinion, I'm like, well,
just explain the reason.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
well, you say it's random, but like we came together. What do you mean it's random?
In that case, I usually make a rule ahead of time. If it's like, okay, couples who are going to cross this line, I'm ahead of time, the one on the left-hand side or whatever, and just explain like, oh, like you were closest to my like the left foot or whatever.
And we don't want to make this more difficult than it has to be. So if they do really want to feel heard, first I would offer to chat with them about their concerns first, or connect them with somebody else who can hear their concerns. And if they're adamant about taking the survey, we don't want to make your lives hard, so you can let them take the survey, make a note of perhaps the time that it was, so that we can factor that in when we look at their response to decide whether it's somebody that we want to include or not. Because we don't want to make anything uncomfortable for anybody else. We just may end up randomly removing a few people in order to keep the random method of it. But we don't want to make things hard.
We may be doing like more brainstorming later of like how to word things, but do you have any suggestions for like if we do have a group come up at once and we've identified like, okay, that's the person that crossed at the right time, like how do you sort of say like, hello everyone, I want to talk to you. Like,
Yeah.
only talk to one person in a whole group.
Yeah. It definitely can be challenging. You would approach the group as a whole and then, in a certain way, single somebody out, but really relying on this. We're doing a random intercept method of approach in the galleries. We're selecting every third visitor who crossed the threshold, and even though for our purposes we're then also defining it as the person close to us, you can just say, you were the third person who crossed, so as a part of this random intercept method, we were hoping that you could take the survey. Won't take too long while everybody else looks around, and people are generally really comfortable with that. There's other fun ways, if you want to take it in that direction, to make it a game, saying there are 2 other people fielding today. Maybe you'll find them and you'll get to be the third person the next time. But it's generally not as uncomfortable. It doesn't go that far frequently. People either don't want to do it because they don't want to take time out of their group, or they want to take a break and sit on a bench and they'll be happy to do it. So it's good to anticipate those kind of questions in the fun way that you'll end up answering them, but you'll get a yes or no more frequently than you'll get a maybe.
Yeah. So these are good scenarios to have in mind. Like Maddie was saying, they don't happen that frequently.
I do have a question. It might be a silly question, but
no worries.
There aren't any.
Like we're at like a transition point, and so if we're having a group waiting for that one individual to finish the survey, and if they suggest to us, and we only have one iPad, just come walk along with us. They'd rather walk and do the iPad. Is it okay that we just kind of go with them, and then we create a new line wherever we ended up, and come back, or how does that work?
I'd probably, or I'm curious to see your take on this. This is a different scenario than I've heard before, but I've seen it. You're welcome to walk with them, or if their group is going over here and there's a bench over here in the next gallery and they want to sit there, to me that's all completely fine because we're keeping on the random intercept model. One thing that we haven't discussed much in the research and evaluation team is whether people will be moving around the museum when they're fielding or sticking in one location. So right now I'd say probably go back to where you were before and start all over again. It's totally fine to go with people. Sometimes you'll even find individuals who use this as an opportunity to socialize a little bit with you as the survey fielder, and that's fine too. Whatever we can do to make them agree to take the survey and make it a good experience for everybody.
I agree totally. It's actually my secret technique. This often happens where people say, oh, but my group's moving on, and it's very easy to say, I can come with you. You can do it wherever you like.
Tanya's very cool.
It's fine, whatever makes you comfortable. So that it's actually a really good question, and a technique I'd suggest you use.
Yeah.
What happens if somebody says, I'm not from around here?
We might do it.
Not a problem.
Yeah, not a problem.
If you're a tourist, welcome.
Yep.
That's right.
What if somebody says flat out, no?
Thank you.
Thank you.
What about if kids won't? Oh, yeah.
We didn't really cover 3.
Oh, it's true. What if they want to participate but haven't been selected? It does.
What we normally say, like explain why.
Or I would say based on your experience, because you've done some of the exit surveys, what are some of the things that you've had success saying before?
I think it's hard at first to do that until you do a lot of them, and then it'll come very smoothly. But what I've done is once you select somebody, is I almost do a little slight body language to kind of the iPad over here, and I kind of then focus. And usually I step forward just a little bit and make complete eye contact with the person you selected. And it doesn't have to be like stand off. It's just more like maybe just your both sides. You're kind of cornering that person a little bit. And then by stepping forward, maybe just leaning forward just a little bit to show your focus. Then you make direct eye contact, like, okay, now we're beginning. That does make the people, they're still going to occasionally do it, but that's one of the hardest things is you're trying to talk and then somebody says, oh, well, I didn't like, whatever. Yeah. Until you get, it's going to be very uncomfortable, not very, but it'll be somewhat uncomfortable until you get your own method of doing that. So.
Yeah. How you said body language is always he again. So I didn't hit on those long enough, but approaching somebody with a smile, looking them in the eye, and facing their direction lets them know that you're going to approach them to ask them something. We can go from there.
Let me ask one more question. Is there any, on some of the surveys we've done, there is a place where if they've been providing input, whether you can, they help it or not, is there going to be a place for other visitors in the group? Are there any input from them, or is it going to be pretty much the selected?
This one right now is just focusing on the selected, things that we've done in the past, and I believe you might have done them as well, as having like comment cards available so that while somebody's taking the full survey, other people can comment on their experience so they feel heard. We can talk about that more too, to explore that option as well, because those usually are only used more for internal purposes on the museum rather than feeding into the study, but it does really make the other visiting party members feel heard if they want to.
That's great. What about if somebody's kids won't sit still for a survey? Or they say, oh, I'm worried about my children.
Sarah had a really great suggestion over here.
You could have a few family gallery guides just with you and say, oh, they might want to check these out while we're taking the survey. It'll only take a few minutes.
Yeah.
I do not recommend offering to watch a kid. I did that during the festival, and the kid ran in the parking garage. I found him. Very stressful. I forgot that I was supposed to be watching him, and I was like, whatever, Andrew, come back, or I don't know. Do not do that. Don't do that.
It's not exactly random, but if you wanted to make sure you got families with young children, because you can't hold them back and then have something horrible happen. I wondered if you could target these surveys for like next to the tables where we have like an art spot, or during the festivals where we have a room where it's just arts and crafts. All the kids are sitting, all the parents there's nowhere to sit, and all the parents are just like this while their kids build things and make things, and it seems like you could snare randomly lots of parents at the festival.
Yeah, I think for the one thing that we are intentionally not doing right now as part of the survey is surveying during festivals or during special events, because that does feel so different than a general museum visit, and that's what we're trying to better understand. But outside of festivals, definitely Saturday and Sunday day programming would be a good one to think about when we're putting together our fielding guide, because we do want to make sure that we aren't not hearing from certain people, and you'll see, when the refusal log, we're not exactly capturing why people are refusing, but in the partial complete log, we'll be able to see if there's a trend there with families running out of time, because that's a group where that likely happens.
Yeah.
Are we counting every adult that crosses the threshold for?
Good point.
Yeah.
Yes, we want this survey to be taken by people who are over 18. And so I do not believe that we would include even teenagers at this point.
That's a really important question. We are counting every single adult. We're looking for anybody over 18. And if you are not sure, you can feel free to ask, saying that for this survey, we're only looking to talk to adults. Just wanted to make sure you were over 18 and hope that they'll give you an honest answer. There are going to be groups who are ineligible for the survey that will fall under common sense. It won't be anybody who's an employee of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, anybody that's a volunteer of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, anybody that is visiting with a school group or a part of a school tour. If there is a school group there with their teacher, you don't need to count them as a part of your count or anybody to consider. And I'd meant to open that up earlier to see if there's any other groups that I may be missing that we should make sure not to intercept. Vendors too, I don't know if I mentioned that one, anybody who's employed anywhere throughout the museum, or they're potentially looking at the space for a special event with a staff member, doesn't need to be intercepted, people like that. And anybody else come to mind right away that I may be missing? What was that?
Say spouses. There was somebody walking along, they say, my wife's a volunteer here. Is that okay? Or what do you think?
That was a tricky one. It'd be good to have just a standard. I imagine it would depend on whether they're visiting for pleasure or whether that wife is volunteering at that moment, and they're just there for for reasons other than deciding to visit on their own.
Yeah, you introduced a really good question, and I'm leaning towards what Tanya said, exactly that. If they're not a volunteer, we'd be interested in the general relationship that they have to the museum, not being highly affiliated. So that would be, that's how I would approach it as a follow-up question with that, to figure out. They volunteer as well, and if they don't, then they'd be eligible.
So these are really good questions. We want these to come out with this discussion, because then you won't get tripped up when you're out in the actual galleries.
Can I say something else
Yeah,
on that?
yeah.
The questions are going to continue to come, and you'll experience things as you start doing this that we didn't cover. And just, I would say use your best judgment, and then shoot the scenario to Laura or Alyssa, and we can advise on that and send that to all the survey collectors, so we're kind of building our knowledge and sharing experiences as we start to do this work.
Yeah. And if you ever have any real concerns about whether a response should be considered or not, you can just record the time and let someone on the Nelson Atkins team know the time that survey came in if you really are concerned about it not being good data, and we'll be able to look at that record exactly based on the time it was taken. Great.
So what's the answer to number 6?
The answer would be to say, here I can help a little bit, give your kids something to do while you might take the survey. If this is if it ends up being a consistent problem for multiple people, there are other strategies, like a little basket of coloring books and crayons or something that we tend to recommend at museums that have higher populations of families coming in. So it would be good to try out first to see if that's happening a lot, if you've got a lot of families who just are too busy. And then we can strategize for the next step for that.
Yeah, that'll be a good feedback loop one to the surveying team. It would be offering them something to do, letting them know how long it is so that they'd be fully informed if they wanted to take the time. And if they say it would be too difficult with their kids, it's okay. And we'll just find, we'll use that as the feedback tool to find out if we're missing certain people.
One thing, they're going to be on iPads.
Yep.
Are we asking the questions throughout as we usually do here? We're handing in the iPad.
Yeah. In the next section, once we get through this, we'll go through screenshots of what the app looks like and what your part will be in handing it over and taking it back, but it will be different in this setup. Yeah. Though if somebody does ask if you will read it to them, if they have a hard time reading it due to the font size, or just it would be an easier experience to do so, we encourage, if you have the time and ability, and welcome you to do that. Just don't interpret for them besides what's written there.
Which relates to the next thing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Have you guys considered like shortening the survey to try to maybe include people with children? Because you tell me with someone with kids, this could take 10 minutes, and I'll be like, no thanks. Immediately. And I think that's going to be the common response with people with kids is not that I don't want to help, it's just, I got kids. And to me, you kind of exclude those voices.
Yeah, what I'm hearing a lot right now that I think I'd like to consider a little bit more and talk with our team that's been developing the survey with the Nelson Atkins is potentially tracking why people say they can't take the survey. Right now, that's not something that we're doing, because in other surveys we include a whole thing called a refusal log where we understand who people that are refusing to take the survey look like. But that makes a lot of assumptions about people that can be difficult and uncomfortable. We want to know if we're not hearing from people. We ask people to guess age. We ask people to guess race and ethnicity, and we've chosen not to do that for that survey because there's too much discomfort and risk associated with that. But we have also not included a question about why they can't, and that would be our way of knowing if we're missing families, and then we can start making modifications from there. So maybe we'll introduce that into the discussion a little bit more, because hearing everybody's feedback on this has been helpful to know it's a concern. Yeah.
And then related to that, there's families, but also what about people who might be coming from abroad or might not speak English very well? Yeah. What might you do?
I just have a quick question.
Oh, yeah.
If they say, well, I can't take it because it's 10 minutes, can we actively say, well, how about 4 minutes, or should we not encourage partial surveys?
I think for right now, we shouldn't encourage partial surveys unless we start running into a timing issue, which really within the first few days of being on the ground and seeing the kind of response rate we're getting, or the agreement rate, or how many people really are saying that was too long at the end, we can start making modifications then. But that's always the fun yet challenging part of the first time we do the in-museum intercept surveys, where it is an experiment for a couple of days. Yeah. We're doing the in-community intercept surveys in the spring and summer because it's going to be much more fun to be outside in the community in the spring and summer, but we'll also be able to identify some of these issues during this initial almost like testing phase to be able to answer those questions. Yeah. Because we don't want to encourage partial respondents, but we do want to know if it's too long.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Is there any tallying of how many people you ask and how many people say no?
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking we should start moving on to showing examples of this.
If you guys want to see it, it's going to be
we definitely will be tallying the yes and no's. We haven't talked about how granular we'll even get between the yes and no's between certain locations in the museum, because again, it's this compromise of wanting to go to where people are, but also wanting to make sure we don't miss people who visit their favorite galleries that may be places that don't get as much visitation too. Yeah. So we'll definitely be tracking it and let you know.
Yeah. So I'll actually just go through these last two very quickly. If somebody doesn't speak English, currently the survey is designed only to be taken in English. So I believe we would want to know that as a reason perhaps why they aren't able to take the survey, to know whether that is a voice that we're not hearing from. So I think we'll want to collect that.
And if they do want you to read it, if it's a little bit easier to read and speak, it's easier to speak and hear English than read English, that is something you can offer as well.
Yep.
That depends on your level of comfort doing that too.
And then if they've been there for 10 minutes, that's perfectly fine.
But these questions have actually been really great and are really helpful to us before we start launching the survey. So please continue to ask them throughout this training or as they come up before or after we go on the floor. So getting to know the survey instrument a little bit more. After we show you the survey app that you'll be using when fielding these in-museum intercept surveys, we will give you a couple of minutes just to click through it yourself with your groups. We only have a certain number of iPads, but just so you can get familiar with the tool yourself and see the kind of questions that we are asking people. Nearly all of the questions in the survey are optional, so they can skip them if they want to. I just wanted to emphasize again, all of the demographic questions at the end are optional, so there is always an answer. There's always an answer option saying prefer not to answer, or they can skip it. You can let them know if any hesitation comes up on their end that they are not required to answer these questions. They can give you back the iPad or they can skip all of them. It's up to them, but that's entirely up to them whether they like to share that personal information with us. The only other questions that are required are questions that have branching logic, which means if you say yes, I've been to the Nelson, there may be another question asking how many times, but if you say no, you won't be asked that question. Or our forced choice questions, those 3 set of somewhat difficult questions that we need for this really exciting segmentation analysis we'll do at the end. In terms of the types of questions on the survey, which we already talked a little bit about at one point, the survey opens up with questions about visitation history in Kansas City, with 2 questions asking what types of places they've been in Kansas City. General desired experiences for leisure time preferences. So that example of when you go out to spend your free time, what do you hope to get out of it? What do you hope to do? We also want to know, we ask questions about their relationship to and preferences for arts and culture. So if they participate in arts and culture, do they like to take things in or participate? When they're learning about something, do they want to read about it or do they want to talk to somebody about it to understand those different desired experiences? Then the questions get a little bit easier when we get to just awareness and perceptions of the museum and visitation history, their experiences at the museum, any possible ideal experiences in the future, and any barriers they may have right now for frequent visitation. And this same survey is the survey that we'll be asking community members who are non-visitors to the museum or haven't visited in a while, so we can see how people answer similarly or differently based on what type of person they are and where we intercept them. Because I'm sure there are people out in the community who haven't come to the Nelson Atkins in 10 years, if ever, who are participating in arts and culture, and we'd like to understand how they're doing that, why, what they hope to get out of it, so that can inform the work that you're doing here as well. Then at the end, there'll be a round of demographic questions, which ask about age, race, ethnicity, zip code, and income, all of which are optional. Just to familiarize you with the survey instrument, the survey tool itself, we use the Qualtrics survey platform, and that'll be an application that'll be on iPads that we'll share with you all after we click through these example slides. So just to show you exactly what it'll look like, you have the Qualtrics offline survey app. As the name suggests, you do not need Wi-Fi to use this app when out in the galleries. It'll only be used when uploading responses, which I don't think any of you will be responsible for. Once you click into the app, there should only be one survey there, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in-museum intercept survey. I don't believe there will ever be a time where the community and the in-museum will be next to each other. If there are, we'll pass along that knowledge so you know to make sure to only do the in-museum version. You'll click on that, and this is the screen that pops up. It's really easy as there are very few choices to select from. When you get this app and you're going out to survey and you're ready to start intercepting people, you'll just click Take Survey, and that first question will ask if the visitor agreed or refused to take the survey, which is how we'll be able to track response rate. In the more often than not chance that the visitor is going to agree to take the survey, you'll select yes, and then hit next on the bottom right of the screen. And then you will hand over the iPad to the survey taker. This is the first screen that they'll see, and then they will have a seat or stand to the side and participate in the survey. Once they're, this is an example of the first question they see. In the past 12 months, have you been to any of the following types of places or events? Please select all that apply. And when they are done with the survey, they will see a screen that thanks them for spending their time on the survey and lets them know their response has been recorded, and they should hand the iPad back to you. That's what we see people do nearly every single time. If they do hit the restart button themselves, no problem. It just goes back exactly to this first screen you saw, but the difference will be there'll be a pending response there now, and these numbers will shift depending on how many people are fielding the survey, depending on how many people agree, but you'll just notice that afterwards there'll be a new pending response. And you just hit Take Survey again, and we're back to the beginning. If somebody says they do not want to participate in the survey as we have it programmed right now, you just hit no, hit next. You'll get that same thank you screen, as that is our last screen of the survey. Hit restart, and we're back to this initial screen showing 2 responses. Sound pretty straightforward so far? Great. And we'll again have iPads in hands in a few minutes so you can practice yourself. In the few cases where people do have a partial response, what will happen, and I'll just go back once more, a partial response is, let's say they hand it back to you mid-survey, say, sorry, I have to go meet a friend for coffee, I can't complete the survey anymore. You thank them, and you'll hit that X in the top right corner, and then this exit survey will pop up, and if they have in fact said they cannot participate anymore, when it asks you've chosen to exit the survey, exit now, just say yes. It'll ask you to give a reason, and you can just put in a couple of words, had to meet friend, ran out of time, just something that lets us know the main barrier. And we've talked a lot about the ones that we anticipate, whether they say it's too long, I ran out of time, my kids need my attention, anything like that will let us know any trend to follow from the partial responses. And that's it. You'll see there for the partial response, there's a little 1 in the bubble up there, but these aren't things that you need to pay a whole ton of attention to. I'm just trying to show you what the screens will look like one by one before you look at the app yourself. This is another partial respondent screen. So the next part was we're going to go back to our groups and do another bit of a group exercise where we practice the ask together. Since we do have our language that we've used in the past and had success with, but want you guys to make it your own, find your own way of asking. Think about different ways to make sure you include a couple of those key components of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art's name specifically, letting them know their input is important, and the time, but just getting to practice that a little bit before we go out on the floor. And we will hand out the iPads so you can play with the app a little bit. We do have 8 iPads, so it will have to be groups of 3 to 4. So I think for now, stick with the groups that you were in. We might do a little bit of readjusting once we start handing out the iPads, but please practice the ask, and then take a look at the iPad, and you can click through some of those questions yourself, and we'll be walking around or available if you have any questions with that. Anything else initially? Any questions?
All right. Feel free to discuss as you're practicing your ask. We'll hand out the iPads and let you know where your group's going to go.